So now with this tutorial, we're going to be moving into developing the logo or the icon elements or the button elements for the UX UI design that you're going to be working on for this exercise. So the preceding step, we went over the background and working with gradients. And I wanted to show one more aspect of gradients really quickly. Again, this is something more of an advanced step, or I guess more intermediate step. But this is also for people that maybe are wondering how to do this and are looking to have a little bit more control with their gradients. So one thing that I noticed as I was finishing this last step was that I was like, oh, that's weird. This gradation is really like way longer. Like it's way longer than what I was seeing over here. And then I realized, oh, it's because in this situation and in this example, this interface that I'm working off of, they maintain this tone, and there's not really a gradation shift until you get down to this area right here in this interface. So the way to deal with that when you're working with gradients, because you can't really insert like a solid block of color, is that you can just clone or duplicate the slider value in your gradient. So this is through the gradient dialog box. I'm going to hold down on this slider. I'm going to hold down Option, and then that is going to duplicate that same value so I don't have to go through and reselect it. And then I'm going to bring that over, and now you see that that is giving me this solid area of fill here where I'm not wanting there to be any sort of gradation that's happening. And I'm able to move that a little bit over so that now this is a lot more closely matched to what is actually happening in my example. So this is more of a preference thing, and you don't need to have this really complicated gradient for this project, but I do want to show people how to work with some of these more intermediate steps when you're working with this one tool, because this is something that, thank goodness, gradients aren't as used inappropriately as they used to be, like in the early 90s. Like when graphic design started being used more when digital tools were starting to be used more for graphic design, there was like an explosion of gradients and this overuse of gradients, because it was this thing that's like really hard to do when you're working with photographic images, and that was the way that a lot of ads were done prior to working digitally, is that you were doing these setups where you're working with multiple transparencies and illustrations, but then you were doing all these with photographs and overlays, and then you're bringing in these hand-drawn or hand-painted illustration elements. So I think that when digital tools were first being used in graphic design, everyone was like, oh, we'll just put a gradient on it. It's like the 90s version of put a bird on it. But that was really happening a lot, and it was not a good time for design. So now these are much more subtle, and so it's important to know how to have that kind of subtle control. And that is using the slider. In a lot of UX UI design, they do utilize gradients, but they are very subtle, and it's something that they don't even want people to necessarily notice them or identify them as gradients. It's more just to help guide the eye and to offer some kind of alteration or some kind of texture in the background of these different apps. So knowing how to use these subtly and having a lot of control over the way that they're behaving is a key visual aspect of being a little bit more advanced with these UX UI designs. So I wanted to show that. And now let's move on to some of these logo and icon elements. So I'm going to show people a couple of strategies that I sometimes work with when I'm trying to recreate these elements or draw new ones. And the first part of that is, let me go over to layers, and I'm going to lock this background layer and make just a new little, we'll just call this buttons. And this is something, again, you don't need to be matching all of these layers and their names up to what I'm doing. We don't look at your Illustrator files for these projects. We're just looking at what you're exporting. And this is more just the best practices. This is how I have made things work a little bit better for myself when I'm doing design projects. So everyone maybe is going to work a little bit differently. So don't feel like you have to do exactly what I'm doing when I'm working with layers or naming things. But I would recommend making a new layer and then locking your background layer, because as you're going to be messing around with the layout with these things and experimenting with different stuff, you don't want to be accidentally editing these elements that you've already mostly finished. All right, so for this tutorial, I'm mostly going to be focusing on a couple of these elements, the text elements, and then also drawing these button elements. So let's start with this. So I'm looking at these and I'm just pulling out the ones that are more basic shapes, and I'm going to use a combination of shape tools and then some of the features that you have with shape tools in the newer versions of Illustrator. So for those of you that are using CS6, if you don't see some of these same editing and transformation abilities, it's okay, but it is good to know why, or what, what is possible with these more recent versions, and that maybe can help you decide, is it worth it to try and get a newer version of this program. So here I'm going to just start with this play button, and that's a pretty easy place to start. I'm going to create an outline, and I can do that relatively quickly. And so because I've sized my artboard and to match the screen dimensions, and I took this directly from a screen capture that I took from my device, I can actually just trace essentially on this starting image. So I'm going to make first an outline here, and it's mostly going to match, and this just applied the fill, and I don't want that. I actually want that to be transparent, and then for the outline I want this to be white. So I have this perfect circle now. I'm not going to be checking the exact size of these things, but I will try and make it as exact as I can just for this tutorial, just within the bounds of what is reasonable in terms of the time for all of you watching this. So I have this now, so I'm going to actually move this over just so I can then work with this play button. So I'm looking at this as a relatively simple object, and I know that these rounded corners, if you have earlier versions of Illustrator, you're not going to have this option, but in versions of CC versions of Illustrator, you're actually able to create basic shapes and then round the edges, which is a huge time saver. Oh my gosh. It has literally saved my life on some design projects. So I'm going to go to my polygon tool. I'm going to double click it. Nope, sorry, that doesn't work. I'm going to click once. I'm going to change this to 3, and we'll say radius of 50 pixels is fine for now. So now I have my triangle, and I'm going to hold down Shift while I transform this so I can make sure that this has just gone the 90 degrees that I needed to, or I guess it's 40, no, that was 90, yeah. And then I'm going to size this to be roughly the same size as this play button here. And now this is the cool thing that you can do with newer versions of Illustrator. When you hover over these little dots, so they're kind of on the inside of the outline or the path of whatever shape you've drawn. You see how the cursor changes to that little curve, and that actually allows you to create rounded edges, and it will also apply that equilaterally to all the different edges. So I've just been able to create this very simple 3-point vertex object and change the edges a little bit and round those edges a little bit so that now I have these nice rounded edges. And I'm going to look for a resource on how to do this with earlier versions of Illustrator, but for those of you that are working with CC, that is how you are able to quickly create these rounded edges. And so now I'm going to select both of these. I'm zooming out. I'm going to bring this over to my, hold on. And this is what I'm saying about making sure you have these other layers locked. If this was all on one layer, and if this layer wasn't locked, I'm trying to quickly select these so I can just draw my selection tool around them, and I know that it's just these two objects. I'm not having to work with or worry about accidentally selecting all these multiple objects. So now I brought this over here, and I know that I want these two to be centered within one another, so I'm going to go up to the Align option and center those horizontally. Oh, but then I'm realizing, when you're working with logos and buttons sometimes, what the actual center is of something and what your eye sees at the center of something is a little bit off. So I'm going to actually just change that up a little bit, and then I'm going to set this to have no outline and then a white fill. And so now I have this button that's pretty much identical, and the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select both of these elements because I want them to be joined. I don't want to be having to keep like selecting this and then selecting this or drawing this square around them. So instead I'm going to do this once, and then I'm going to go to Command G and group them, and now this object is its own little object. And if I wanted to, I can easily duplicate it. I'm holding on Option right now and dragging. And it just really expedites things. So once again, we're not going to be looking at your Illustrator files. It's not like we're going to be, docking you points if you don't have all these objects groups, but it is definitely going to make things easier for you. All right, and also with layout, so now I have this selected, and I know that this is looking like it's definitely in the center of this screen, so I can select this and then go up to Align to Artboard, and now when I hit center, or the vertical center, it's going to be aligning this to the vertical center point. So I can do that once it's grouped. If it wasn't grouped, what would happen is it would align both of these to the vertical center point, and as we've already seen, this button actually makes a little bit more sense when the triangle inside the circle is a little bit offset from the center. And that's just the way that our eye sees these different shapes. All right, so I have this now. So that is my play button, and I'm going to look at this and just try and approximate this. Okay, so let's go into this shape, this next shape. I want to show you can also use this rounded edges or this rounded corners function of Illustrator to work with these types of shapes here that you see in the step forward and step back icons. And that the starting image is just a rectangle. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to approximate this rectangle. And then I'm going to change the fill. I'm going to move this over. And I'm going to have to zoom in pretty close to do this. And I'm going to pull these in. And then I say, okay, so I want this actually to be a little bit shorter. And maybe I want it also to be a little bit skinnier. So you want to be utilizing that zoom tool, that magnifying glass, which is over here. I'm using the hotkey Z, but that can help with fine-tuning things, because if you're trying to do this when you're totally zoomed out, as you can see, you don't have as much control. So when you start zooming in, it gives you almost pixel perfect control over these different vector objects, and especially using these little features and the rounded corners feature. So that is what I want to use for that element. And so now I'm going to do something that is also something that can save a lot of time when you're working with recreating these elements and also maintaining a level of consistency in your designs. And that is, okay, so I see that this shape and this shape, those are the same shapes. And if I were to draw another polygon, I could just redraw this and rescale it, but then when I start working with the rounded corners, it's going to have it's going to be harder to get that to be exactly the same thing. So what's easier for me is to just go into this group, and that's where I just double-clicked on that group to get to that group isolation mode, and this is all playing on these things that we've been learning in previous modules. So I'm going to select this one object, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to escape to get out of that group isolation mode. I'm going to paste. So I'm pasting this outside of the group, so now it's its own object. And then I'm just going to come over here, I'm going to transform this, and I'm just going to size this a little bit so that it's going to be closer to this. And so I see, okay, so this is actually a slightly different proportion, but that's not a big deal because I can just go like this, and not holding down Shift, I'm now able to change the proportion of that slightly, but I'm still able to use roughly the same image components or the starting components to develop these different buttons. And this is also maintaining that consistency of that same degree of rounded edges that I have. So I'm going to move this over, and so now I can do two things. I can select this and I can group this, and then let's say I know, okay, I see this is horizontally center, no, this is vertically center, sorry, with this play button. So I can then select both of these buttons, and I can go up here, make sure that I have Align to Selection selected now instead of Align to Artboard, and I can hit this button, which is the vertical center. So now I know that this vertically is aligned with the center of this object. And I'm just going to guesstimate that. Okay, and so now I have this, and I could try and do the same thing. I can go through the same process and try and draw this, or I can just duplicate this. So I'm holding down Option and Shift, and that's actually keeping it so that I have, I'm keeping this on the same line, the same vertical line as I'm duplicating it. And then with that selected, I can go up to Object and go to Transform, and then go to Reflect. And then I can say I want this to reflect vertically. So what this is going to do is this is going to flip this along the vertical axis. And I'm going to say OK. So now it's created, it's transformed this to be a perfect reflection. And there's a lot of ways I could have done this. I could have duplicated this and then rotated it. But the thing is, if for whatever reason this had been, well, I don't even know if that is lined up, but if in this design this icon looked more like that, if I had then duplicated it and then tried to rotate it 180 degrees, it would have looked like this. So there are times when you want to use that reflect. There are times when you want to use rotate. It really just depends on the ultimate visual goal that you're trying to achieve, and just knowing these different differences and knowing when you want to use one transform process versus another. It really just comes with working with these different tools a lot. Okay, so these are these more shape-based icons and buttons. And the other cool thing about these is that once you have these grouped, you can go and change the colors of them relatively easily. So you're not trying to select each object independently, and you're able to change them and make these adjustments and apply that to the whole thing. So if maybe part of my goal ultimately with this interface is to change the color of these buttons, I can do that when I have these grouped. I can do that a little bit more easily. And you can also use the direct selection tool to select objects within a group if you're trying to create different colors. So what happens when you're working with something that's a little bit hard? You know, there isn't like a volume button or like a check mark shape that you can draw. So what I'm suggesting, and this is going to be the last thing that I show for this step, is just working with the pen tool to create some of these more complex shapes. So let's do I'm going to use the volume, just a little bit of a challenge. All right, so I'm going to use the pen tool to create this icon, and I'm going to start with this, drawing this as one shape, and then I'm going to create this one single curve, and then I'm going to use that one curve to create these other curves to make it a little bit more what is the word I'm looking for? Consistent. If you're working with these types of designs where you have one element that looks like it's just transformed slightly, it's always better to just start with that one element and not try to redraw multiple elements when you can easily copy and paste and then transform those duplicate objects. Let's start first with this. I'm just going to zoom in, and I'm going to use this pen tool to create this object. I'm going to hold down Shift where I know it is relatively straight, and so there aren't really a lot of curves here. So I'm actually just going to approximate this as though there are no curves. And I did a rough job, and I can see that there's some spots where, oh, you know, maybe I want to change this a little bit. So I'm going to go back in after creating this and completing the object with the pen tool. I'm going to then take the direct selection tool and move around a couple of these vertexes. Once I have one of these vertexes selected, I can then use the directional arrows to fine-tune them. But depending upon if you have snapping on or not, it might actually just be easier to drag and drop and to try to just kind of base it on what you're working with as the object, as the image that you're tracing. So I'm going to try and make this match as much as I can. And it's not going to be perfect, and I want people to to know that it's okay, there's going to be a certain number of objects, or sorry, button objects or logo objects that we ask you to recreate for these assignments. And we're not looking for them to be pixel perfect, but we just do want to see that you are going through this process of working with these pen tools and working with these different creation tools to try to get something close to these shapes. And it can be definitely hard. And then, so because I know I have, I think I can, oh yeah. So I have, I'm using a later version of Illustrator, so I am working in CC. So I can actually then use, I get these little handles, and I can actually round this just from within that process, and I don't have to worry about using the curve tool on this. So that seems like a good enough, pretty good place to start with that icon. And so now I'm going to try and make this curve, and let's do some pen tool magic here. So when I'm working with curves and I want them to be relatively equal, the way that I do this is I think about breaking up every curve into 3 points, and that's the starting point, the midpoint, and the end point. So I'm going to put down 1 point here at the starting point. I'm going to go to about the midpoint. I'm going to hold down the cursor, and that allows me to get this handle. So I see that I have this handle drawn out, and then I'm going to go back over here to the end point, and if I did a good job approximating this, then this curve is going to be pretty even. And as you can see, since I have a fill applied to this and no outline, I'm not seeing the outline, I'm just seeing the inner fill applied. In order to escape out of this, I'm going to hold down Control or Command, and then I'm going to click anywhere outside the object, and now I'm going to hold down V to select that object, and I'm going to go over here and swap the fill for the stroke, and now I have this line, this curve that I've created, and this looks pretty close. I mean, it's not, so I'm seeing that it's a lot thinner than what I'm tracing when I'm trying to recreate. So I'm going to go up to the stroke. I'm going to change that. Maybe I'm going to change that to 2 point. And then there are some ways to continue to edit these further, depending upon what version of Illustrator you're working with. So I'm going to select this, and I'm going to go over, oops, select this, there we go. And I'm going to go over here to the stroke panel. And these are some fine-tuning options. And so once again, these are things that you can work with when you're starting to get into more intermediate UX UI designs. It is really important to be able to have this control, or to at least know where these levels of control and these parameters exist within these programs, because this is something that when you get into doing these designs and you're working with a product and you're working at a company who's developing an app and you're a UX UI designer, you have to actually worry about the stroke value, and then what your cap is, and how this is all looking when it outputs to the screen. So in this situation, the default for Illustrator is to have a square cap, but you can actually change that, and that's over here. So this is actually creating that rounded cap, and that is a closer match to what I'm seeing in this original design. So I'm going to use that. I set it to a round cap, and then, as I was saying before, I'm going to duplicate this, and let's just duplicate that once. And then I'm going to change the size of that. And then I'm going to come back, duplicate that again. And when you're zoomed in and you're working with strokes, it's important to remember that to select strokes when you're really zoomed in, you're not, the Illustrator doesn't really recognize the stroke value. You have to make sure to be selecting that path. So you can see that when I'm outside of the path, and this is the value of the stroke, so it's a thicker width, but Illustrator doesn't really see that as part of it sees that differently. So it's not seeing that as a fill. It's only seeing the inner path that is then determining, well, depending upon what stroke up value you have applied to that path, that's determining the way that it's visually looking on the screen. But Illustrator really, when you're working with strokes, it's only looking at the paths that are generating the strokes. It's not looking at the width of the actual stroke. So you have to select that center path. And this is something that you don't have with earlier versions of Illustrator. You're not seeing, a lot of times you're not going to get these little helpful things that show you that you have them selected, But if you're wondering why you're clicking all over this object and you can't actually select it, if it's a stroke object, just make sure you're going towards the center. And then I'm going to duplicate this again. And this one, I think I'm just going to stretch out a little bit. All right, so now I'm going to zoom out, and I see that looks pretty good. There's a couple things happening, and that was, one of them was because of my settings, when I was transforming the object, it was also transforming the stroke. And there's ways to set that. I'm not going to show that right now, but I am just going to select all these different stroke objects and then apply the same level or the same width of stroke to them. And then I'm going to select them all again and make sure that I have Align to Selection selected, and then I'm going to try and distribute them. And let's do that one more time so that they're distributing in the center. All right, so now I have this icon made. So I'm going to group that, and I'm going to bring this over here. And I have yet another icon made, and so this is showing how you can work with the pen tool to develop these more complex stroke objects, or these more complex button objects that there isn't some kind of default shape that you can work with. And in some instances, for example, with this, I would probably do a pen outline here and then use the polygon tool to create that shape. And then in the next video, I'm going to talk about how to, once you have these more finalized, there are ways to further edit them and group them together so that you don't have to worry about changing the fills and then also the stroke outlines to get them to be the same color. But for now, just make sure to save your exercise and then continue on with the next step.